In recent weeks, there's been a great deal of criticism directed at the Occupy Wall Street movement for not having a clearly articulated policy agenda. Come to think of it, one of those critics was me. But today, a number of Occupy Wall Street protesters took on a very clear public policy: the New York City Police Department's policy of stop and frisk. Stop and frisk is very much what it sounds like. It gives police the power to confront, question, and search whomever they deem suspicious, something they felt the need to do over 600,000 times last year. Reportedly, 85% of those stopped and frisked were Black and Latino. So that's why, for a time today, some of the people who've been occupying Wall Street joined those occupying Frederick Douglass Boulevard in Harlem.
Stop and frisk, don't stop the crime!
Stop and frisk is the crime!
Stop and frisk, don't stop the crime!
Stop and frisk is the crime!
Stop and frisk is the crime. A few dozen protesters gathered in and around the NYPD's 28th precinct, some even using the Occupy protest traditional people's mic to tell their stories of police harassment. And after protesters blockaded the precinct, arrests began, including that of my former Princeton University colleague, Professor Cornel West. What happened today not only flies in the face of those who claim Occupy Wall Street has no policy goals, it also challenges another criticism of the now worldwide protests, that it is largely a monochromatic movement that is not very diverse and not particularly interested in questions of racial inequality. You just don't go to Harlem and march through the projects protesting stop and frisk if you're not interested in dealing with racial bias on some level. But questions still remain about how a broad-based global movement like this has and will continue to address the ways that economic inequality and racial and ethnic inequality are intertwined. This economy, as hard as it's been on everyone who isn't part of that 1%, it's hit Black and Latino communities the hardest. The wealth gap was a crack in the ground compared to the canyon it became after the financial crisis. In real terms, you cannot talk about economic inequality in America without addressing race. Today, at least part of this new movement plainly and openly protested at the intersection of race and abuse of power by law enforcement. And they did it in Harlem. So what does this mean for the future of the Occupy movements and for the focus of the Occupy Wall Street? Joining us now is Tim Wise, an educator, anti-racist advocate, and the author of White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Tim, it is so good to see you again.
It is very good to see you.
So I saw you earlier this week, and when you were at Tulane, where I now teach, and where you graduated. And I want to ask you a couple of questions about the Occupy movement.
Sure.
The first is really about this language of occupy. Now many indigenous Native American communities are pretty concerned about the language of occupation. I mean, after all, we just finished our occupation in Iraq. What does it mean to occupy versus decolonizing Wall Street?
I think that's important. I mean, the people of color I've been speaking to around the country, particularly indigenous activists, have been very clear, A, about their support for the goals and the larger narrative of the Occupy movement, but at the same time saying, you have to be careful. When you choose language like Occupy, what you forget, particularly if you are a white activist, is that white folks have been occupying Manhattan, including Lower Manhattan, for hundreds of years. It's not really new. And when they go home from the Park and Wall Street, wherever they may go home to, if it's Greenwich Village, if it's Uptown, if it's the West Side, wherever it is, they're still going to be occupying what was indigenous land. So that is a site of long-standing racial injustice, and it's important to have that narrative. It's not just a historical matter. It is a matter of contemporary reality. If we are trying to build a solidarity movement, we just have to be clear that we're trying to decolonize a colonized and occupied place, not just reoccupy it for better purposes.
Now speaking of a little bit of history, I want to ask you a bit about your own history. You were an activist at Tulane. That's really where you first cut your teeth on this work, doing kind of the divestment from apartheid South Africa work. Tell me a little bit about how that work, like the Occupy work now, can help to reveal aspects of white privilege and the meaning of race work in trying to build progressive commitments and community.
Sure. Well, I think what I learned from that work, and that's been about 2 decades now ago, was that many times, even those of us who are radical and progressive and have all of the right politics in our mind, whatever that means, sometimes manifest both tactics and a narrative that can be off-putting to people of color and that can sometimes prevent us from building the kind of solidarity we need. So in our case, it was choosing tactics of occupying buildings, risking arrest very cavalierly, going on hunger strike, which for those of us who were white, I guess was, we sort of saw that as cool. For a lot of people of color, they were like, okay, good luck with that whole getting arrested thing. Let us know how that works out for you. We don't have the same experience with cops that you do. We also don't have the same experience with hunger and economic deprivation. So we're not going to voluntarily starve ourselves, but good luck with that. And the reason I say that now and that it's important, I'm not saying that's what the Occupy folks are all about. And I think today's development in Harlem is fantastic. But what it suggests is we have to be mindful when we are trying to build a cross-racial movement for social, economic, and political justice that we don't choose tactics that are going to be, for some people, extremely risky. I mean, getting arrested does not mean the same thing when you are white as opposed to when you are black and brown in this country.
Tim, it is always a pleasure to talk to you. I so appreciate your work as an anti-racist advocate and educator, and I appreciate you joining me tonight.
You bet. Thank you.
The best new thing is next. And I don't want to use the words Armageddon or end of days or apocalypse, but just remember, we've still got a couple hours to go, so don't get cocky. That's next.